Well, welcome everyone. My name is Catrin Wigfall, and I'm a policy fellow at Center of the American Experiment and will be your MC for today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome you today to learn a little bit more about what Minnesota's public schools get wrong about reading instruction. So why are we talking about this right now? Why is this important? Well, for one, because of school closures and many students limited to a distance learning model for a good chunk of the school year, more parents are becoming aware of what their child is or isn't learning. For some, they may be seeing signs that their child's reading skills aren't quite what they thought they were, where they thought they were at. For others, they maybe knew that their child was struggling with reading, but now they're seeing that the reading strategies being used aren't helping their child advance. Unfortunately, we have too many Minnesota students who cannot read proficiently. And without a strong foundation of basic literacy skills, a child is at risk of falling further and further behind. In fact, if a child can't read proficiently by the end of third grade, this makes that child 4 times more likely to leave school without a diploma. And even among those who do end up graduating, many are still not proficient readers, as national assessment data have shown. According to Minnesota's most recent state test data, over 40% of students tested in grades 3 through 8 and grade 10 are not reading at grade level. That's nearly 179,000 students. And the number of students, unfortunately, not meeting grade level proficiency has been going up over the years, not down. Among third graders alone, 43% can't read at grade level. But it's not a money problem. Minnesota continues to increase its education spending year after year and even introduces new reading initiatives and programs to try to tackle reading illiteracy. And yet we see that reading performance hasn't improved. This has to deal with how reading is taught, and that teachers often are still being trained in failed reading instruction methods instead of being trained in the science of reading instruction. So when we compare Minnesota reading scores to a state like Mississippi that focuses on training teachers in the science of reading and spends far less than Minnesota to do so, the state is posting higher reading scores among its Black and Hispanic students. They are outperforming Minnesota's Black and Hispanic students. You can read more about Minnesota's performance compared to other states in my education paper, Allergic to Accountability, found at americanexperiment.org. So we know students are struggling to read. How should students learn to read? How does that contrast with the way that public schools have historically taught reading? And what's a better method that parents themselves can use at home with their student? To answer that and many other questions, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dave Ziffer. Dave has been active in education reform since 1994, when he realized that his 4th grade daughter was deeply lacking in both reading knowledge and skill, despite having good grades. In 1961, he escaped becoming a functional illiterate when his mother read the book Why Johnny Can't Read, and subsequently taught him phonics before he entered 1st grade. From 1994 through 2003, Dave was an active contributor to the Illinois Loop, a group of Illinois parents waging the reading wars against the prevailing whole language reading instruction ideology in the schools. From 1997 through 2002, Dave operated an after-school reading program called I Can Read in the Chicago suburbs. It used the world's most research-proven curriculum, Reading Mastery, to teach several hundred students identified by their districts as problem readers to read successfully. The typical student gained 1 grade of reading skill during each 13-week session. Dave's current crusade is My Child Will Read, a volunteer effort here in Minnesota to make parents aware of the dangers of mainstream public school reading and instruction and to provide them with a way to ensure that their children will succeed. If you have questions for Dave as he is presenting, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can when he concludes his presentation. There's also a chat feature should you wish to share thoughts and comments with other attendees. With that, welcome, Dave.
Hi, Catrin. Thank you very much for that intro. So, going to share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
You are good to go.
Okay. Again, my name is Dave Ziffer. I've been an education activist for 25 years, and my latest effort is to reach as many parents as possible, convince them that they must teach their own children to read, and give them the tool to do that. My website is mychildwillread.org. If you go there, it looks like this. It has just a few items on it, and it's fairly sparse. You don't have to spend a lot of time reading it, even if you wanted to read the whole thing. I'll be giving an abbreviated version of my talk today, which normally takes between 60 and 90 minutes. I will speak in person or remotely to your parent group. All you have to do is click on the Contact Us button on the website here and fill out a message to me on this form, and I should be able to get that. Okay. The odds are against your child becoming a good reader. Only 37% of all US 12th graders are proficient readers. The typical 12th grader nationwide reads at an 8th grade level. Fewer than half of children of college graduated parents are proficient readers. So I'm guessing that most of the audience here are college graduates, or at least have some college. You might think your children are immune from illiteracy. According to the data, you'd be wrong. Most kids who succeed probably do so only because their parents helped them. Our schools have been producing terrible results for 80 years, and nothing about this is likely to change in your lifetime. The first 4 items that I read above come from the US Department of Education. They're either stated explicitly, or you can deduce them fairly easily from data in their National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's a report you should become familiar with, the NAEP. They produce it every year. It's on their website. And the results are consistently dismal year after year. You should be worried. In order to understand what's wrong with today's reading instruction, we need to understand how reading works. So let's look at Stone Age reading. Until about 4,000 years ago, all human writing that we know of looked like this. It was on both sides of the planet. Basically, people used pictures, little pictures, to represent ideas or words. In order to read this, you have to memorize most of the icons that you might encounter. There might be hundreds or thousands, or ultimately in English today, there would be hundreds of thousands if we were doing this today. If you encounter one that you haven't memorized, then you have to look for clues in the picture to see what the picture might be about. So you're going to interpret the picture. And if that fails, you have to use the context to guess what the icon might mean. Failing all that, you might guess what the remainder of the text might be based on the part that you've already read. So you might just make up your own version of what the rest of the story is. And as a very last resort, you might look for phonetic clues. So actually, if you read these hieroglyphs, they tend to have little phonetic clues in them. And that's where we ultimately got our alphabet from, but that's a whole nother story. How do we read today? Well, today we have alphabetic languages, which are sound encodings. The reader makes the sound of the word as if someone had spoken it. The reader hears the word, either literally if reading aloud, or mentally if reading silently, as if someone had spoken it. And therefore, the reader understands the text as if someone had spoken it. So in the case of this very simple word here, we are representing the 3 phonemes of the word cat with k, a, and t. And the fluent decoder is able to look at this word and instantly decode this into cat. So this process of fluently recreating the sounds of the words is called decoding. Let's compare Stone Age methods versus school-taught methods. In the Stone Age, going down the left side here, you have to memorize most of the icons that you might encounter. There might be hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of words or ideas represented. And if you encounter an image that you haven't memorized, then you must look for clues in the picture. You have to interpret it. And if that fails, you have to use the context to guess what this particular icon may mean. And if you fail all of that, you have to guess what the remainder of the text might be based on the part you've already read. Let's look at the school-taught methods that are typical today, still today. You have to memorize most of the words you might encounter. There might be hundreds or thousands of them. If you encounter a word that you haven't memorized, then you have to look for clues in accompanying pictures, if there are any. So this works very well in 1st grade, where we're looking at picture books. Doesn't work so well in 4th grade. If that fails, you have to use the context to guess what the word might mean. This is explicitly taught. Students are explicitly taught to do this. And then failing all that, you might guess what the remainder of the text might be based on the part you've already read. So in other words, you're just going to go ahead and make it up. Why are our children failing? Teachers who've been led by cognitive psychologists have been taught for 80 years that reading is about conscious deduction. In this model, word memorization and deduction are used to determine what all the words are. So it's part of a larger paradigm in which only higher order thinking and critical thinking are allowed or revered. Rote learning and rehearsal are disdained, and this explains why modern teachers tend not to teach decoding and reading instruction, or algorithms in math instruction, or factual information in general. Ironically, the education establishment doesn't seem to regard memorizing tens or hundreds of thousands of words as rote, so long as this memorization is disguised as authentic reading. Reading is not an exercise in deduction. Competent readers do not use deduction to figure out what words might be, except when they encounter highly irregularly spelled words or verbally unknown words. If they rehearse a set of just about 70 phonics rules, a competent reader can replay the sounds of the words, much like a tape recorder playing back a tape. They recognize the words from their verbal vocabulary as though the words had been spoken, and hence they do not need to rememorize the entire English language in written form, and they don't have to engage in constant deduction while reading. Let's look at the last 80 years of reading instruction in America's schools. From 1940 to 1980, we had this period that is called look-say. And in this period, we had these readers that were designed to rehearse the words and have the children memorize the words by repeating them over and over again. So many of you may be familiar with the term Dick and Jane readers, and actually it was a series of books called Dick and Jane Do This, or Dick and Jane, go on vacation, or whatever. And it would contain repetitive text like this: see it go up. See it go up, said Sally. Go, up. So this is the style of readers that were in vogue when I went to school in 1961. Unfortunately, I didn't have to depend on them. In 1980, things got a lot crazier. A guy named Ken Goodman came along, and he's the guru, the founding father of a movement called Whole Language. And he put forth the idea that, well, children don't even need to memorize the words. All they need to do is read, and they would automatically pick up the words simply by reading, and they don't have to do any actual memorization exercises. We don't have to send them home with word lists. So I've got a quote from him down at the bottom here. He said, "Word recognition is a preoccupation. I don't teach word recognition. I teach people to make sense of language, and learning the words is incidental to that." So I'd like you to think about that for a moment and process that as to how you would make sense of language without knowing what the words on the page are. Then in the most recent period, it's now called the period of balanced literacy. What they essentially did was change the name so that we no longer talk about whole language. We claim that we're teaching phonics, but we do it in a very incidental way. In each of these three periods, we had a different kind of response from parents and educators and journalists who were fighting back against this ideology. In 1955, a guy named Rudolf Flesch wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. You've probably heard the phrase, but you may not know that it's actually a book, and it sold millions of copies, and it's still in print today. And Flesch said, here's a quote from that book, "Memorizing or guessing the meaning of whole words is not reading. On the contrary, it is an acquired bad habit that stands in the way of your child's ever learning to read properly. My advice is teach your child yourself how to read." And he provided in the back of that book a guide to parents that would allow them to construct their own reading curriculum for their own children. Naturally, that's what my mother did with me. From during this whole language period, we had the reading wars. People were getting online. I was one of them. And we were generating a lot of bad press for the education establishment, basically talking about how can this possibly work? The research does not support what you're doing. The failure levels are unprecedented. This is unbelievable, blah, blah. And the public education administration fought against this ultimately, and they changed the name from whole language to balanced literacy. It's a typical technique when you've got something that's gotten a bad name, you simply change the name. We gave up at the end of the reading wars. Our children were growing up, and we couldn't just continue this fight forever unfunded. And now what we have is journalists writing occasional articles, and they're very good articles talking about what in the world is going on. But the parents have largely gone silent, and we don't have this really loud reading wars going on anymore. So here, for example, is an article that's been published by American Public Media, which interestingly and strangely is one of the harshest critics of the public schools' adoption of failed reading instruction methods. So we have several articles like this that are referred to from my website, mychildwillread.org, and you can follow the links to those by going to that website. Just a note here, during the reading wars in the middle period here, we parents and dissenting educators pointed out that all credible research supported phonics instruction and phonetic decoding. So what was the result of all of this battle that parents and journalists and authors were waging against the education establishment? The answer is that we lost the battle completely and totally. In 1981, Rudolf Flesch wrote 26 years later that basically his appeal to the public and to the education establishment had completely failed, and that things were actually getting worse. As I mentioned before, we used to have this thing called whole language. As a result of all the bad press we generated for whole language during this period here in the middle, they simply changed the name to balanced literacy, but it's really the same old wine in a brand new box. What's happening today, as far as I can tell, is that parents are basically asleep at the wheel. There's no big battle going on. They changed the name to balanced literacy. It makes it sound like they're rational, and anyone who complains against them is unbalanced, therefore. So they simply relabeled their curricula, and all reading curricula are now described as being research-based or evidence-based. So don't be fooled if you go looking up curriculum. Every single curriculum publisher now describes its materials as being research-based or evidence-based. Of course, they create their own research and their own evidence to show that their curricula work. There's an interesting article here, which you can reference again from my site, written by Louisa Moats, one of the most intense supporters of phonics and decoding instruction and research. This article is The Illusion of Balanced Reading Instruction, and she talks about what's going on today in this article. The dangers of today's balanced literacy classroom. Odds are your children are in a class that is being described as a balanced literacy environment. It gives parents the warm feeling that rational centrists have won the reading wars and are now teaching your children phonics. But if phonics is taught at all, it's presented as an abstract set of rules. The sounds are not carefully or extensively rehearsed. Decoding is not taught as the primary recognition method, word recognition method. And phonetic clues, as they call them, are used only as the least preferred deduction method. So they have this set of deductions that you're supposed to use to figure out what the word might be, and as a last resort, oh, you look at the initial letter of the word, and if it starts with a T, then we know that makes the T sound, and that reduces the number of words that you might have to think about when you're trying to deduce what this word might be. The reality is that there is no such thing as balanced literacy. Competent decoders must be trained and exercised just like competent athletes who practice their underlying athletic skills, and competent musicians who practice underlying technical skills like scales and chords. If you're a musician and you have to figure out on the, while you're playing how to play an A major 7 chord, you're not going to hit that chord. And there's an analogy to what today's readers are doing, trying to deduce things that they should be able to do automatically. So children have to practice until decoding becomes automatic. It is very unlikely that your child will become a competent decoder who prioritizes decoding when reading. The teacher really has to be on board with decoding in order for that to happen. All right, now that you're thoroughly depressed, and I hope you are, because this is very depressing material, what's the solution? I've come to the conclusion after spending many years of my life trying to change the education establishment that the establishment is not going to change. And therefore, you have to take matters into your own hands. And this is the tool that you can use to do that. It's called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. It's a $15 book, and it's beyond belief. So where did this book come from? Well, the largest educational research program ever conducted was conducted by the US Department of Education from 1967 to 1977. And in 1977, they published this result. On the left here, we have, well, underneath, we have several different curricula that were tried. So they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different curricula, and they were all competing against each other in this research program. The one on the left, in all 3 measures of things that they were measuring, which is basic academic skills in the dark blue, problem-solving skills in the light blue, and self-esteem, interesting in the red here. Direct instruction, this curriculum on the left, clobbered all the other curricula hands down. I mean, there was just simply no comparison, especially in terms of the things that matter the most, which is basic academic skills and problem-solving skills. It's a long story, but rather than use the results of this study to inform their choice of curricula, the educational establishment just went on to do whatever it was doing before anyway and ignored the results of Project Follow-Through. Direct instruction is a whole set of curricula that includes a reading instruction curricula, and not surprisingly, this curriculum is phonics based, and it teaches children to become competent decoders. And in fact, during the 5 years that I ran an after-school reading instruction program, we used this exact same curriculum that was tested in Project Follow-Through with astounding success. It's one of these things that's kind of jaw-dropping when you see the results that it produces. It's actually hard to believe how good it is, but that just corresponds to the results that you're seeing here on this graph. What is this book? It's a do-it-yourself version of the direct instruction classroom curriculum. It's written by the same authors, using the same strategy with similar content. It's been used by tens of thousands of homeschoolers with incredible success, but you don't need to be a homeschooler to use it. You don't even need to be a phonetic user, a phonetic reader yourself to use it. So I know of people who are not phonetic readers who can't read phonetically, who have trained their own children to read phonetically using this book. That's how amazing it is. Requires about 20 to 30 minutes per day on any schedule that works for you, and it doesn't have to be every day. You don't have to institute a strict regimen to use this book successfully. It is popular. As of mid-January 2021, it was #1 in parenting and family reference on Amazon. It was also #1 in language experience approach to teaching. Well, that's not too surprising. But amazingly, it was also #1 in family activity. Let's see, sometimes it's #2 and it moves around in this list. Let's see where it is today on Amazon. Guess what? It's #1 in family activity. That's a pretty strange thing. This book provides no entertainment value whatsoever. You would think that #1 in family activity would be some kind of fun thing for families to do together, but no, it's this book. Why does it work? It makes no assumptions that your child knows anything about reading. Your child doesn't need to know that letters or words even exist, doesn't need to know the letter names, doesn't need to know anything about upper and lower case that we read from left to right, top to bottom, nothing. It has small incremental steps that produce constant success. It has a special font that helps children distinguish letters. And it has the same instructional patterns throughout. So you do not have to be some kind of master teacher to use this book. There are 6 or 7 or 8 patterns that this book uses over and over again. And you simply become accustomed to these simple patterns, and you don't really need to work that hard. The book lays it out for you. And once you're in the swing of using these patterns, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. And at the end of the book, your child is a reader. At the beginning of the book, there are these instructions. There's a general discussion at the beginning to describe the methods used in the book. I advise you to read this section so that you know what you're doing when you are walking the child through the book. If you have difficulty reading yourself, you can have someone read this section to you. There's a guide to the sounds. So it shows you what sounds you're supposed to make when you see the letters that the child is going to be looking at. And it also has this special font. So let me show you the special font, some of the features of it. For example, when it has a pair of letters that makes a sound that's not the same as the two letters after, in sequence, like CH makes ch, it has them joined together. This helps the child realize that these two represent one sound, or it has them very close together like this. It uses a bar to indicate long symbols like A here. If the letter A appears without the bar, then it's the short sound, it's A. So the child explicitly sees, at least in the earlier part of the book, that there is a distinction between these two sounds, even though we're looking at the same letter. And then it also has other little tricks in it. So for example, one of the hardest things for a child to do is distinguish the letters D from B because they're mirror images from each other. So you'll notice that the D has a little sagging belly here and the B does not. So they intentionally made D and B asymmetrical so that the child would have an easier time distinguishing these two from each other. So this font was heavily researched to demonstrate that children actually do respond better when reading at least the earlier parts of the earlier lessons that are written in this font. Book makes no assumptions that the child knows anything about reading and makes no assumption you know anything about teaching. It shows you in great detail exactly how you're going to walk the child through this book. All right, here's lesson 1. In this lesson, the child is going to learn how to make the sound when looking at the letter M and the S sound while looking at the letter S. You'll sit next to your child at a table. The child will move his or her finger from left to right underneath the sound while making the sound. This teaches left to right. And we'll say, literally the child would go like this, and the child would go, and that is a big part of lesson 1. Your instructions and the child's exercises are combined, so you're both looking at the same thing. It's purely experiential. You tell the child what to do rather than explaining things. And the children are moving their fingers along arrows throughout the book, actually, all the way to the end while making the sounds. Different skills are practiced separately. So here is in a later lesson, the child is looking at the letter S and making the sound S. Well, this is a rhyming exercise. And what you do is you tell the child to rhyme with the sound E and rhyme with the sound at and rhyme with the sound eat. So the child then says see and at and eat. The child then is learning phonemic awareness from this, the idea that the words can be separated into separate sounds that can be represented by letters. And every one of these is done explicitly. There's no implicit understanding that the child knows how to do this. There's very careful instructional design. So let's look, for example, at how the letter R is dealt with in this curriculum. Each new sound, in this case R, is introduced separately. New sounds are generally not used in stories until the reader has practiced them many times in many lessons. So in subsequent lessons, this new sound R is going to become one of the familiar sounds to be practiced. The instruction is designed in small steps so the student always succeeds, leading to automatic and justifiable self-esteem. So here in the letter R, for example, to make sure the child really has got it by the time he or she sees it in a story, it's introduced in this lesson, lesson 9 here. It's practiced alone in lesson 10. It's practiced alone and used in rhyming exercises in lessons 11, 12, and 13. It's used in a word for the first time in lesson 12, and it doesn't appear in a story until lesson 14. So by the time the child sees this letter in the context of a story, it's been extremely well rehearsed. More complex tests are introduced slowly. So for example, blending exercises are followed by blending sounds into short words. So before we did a blending exercise, it was a verbal exercise. Later on now, the child is blending multiple sounds into words, in this case, eat. To avoid confusion in the very early lessons, we don't print the silent letters. So the child is just looking at these phonetic symbols, basically, that he or she has learned how to make. These blending exercises morph into word reading. So words are always composed only of sounds that the child has already learned. The child has already rehearsed all of these letters separately. The leading sounds of the words have already been used in rhyming exercises. And by now we are using correct spellings. And in this case here, the convention in the book is that sounds that we don't pronounce are written in a small font, so the child simply knows not to pronounce these. And that's how we get past the idea that a word like meat, M-E-A-T, at least in this very early lesson here, we're not going to deal with the EA combination. We're just going to deal with the long E. Stories start very simple. So in lesson 13 in this book, we encounter our first story, and it's just 3 words, see, me, eat. Every word and all the sounds in this thing have been practiced before we see the story. There is no reliance on pictures while reading. So this blows a lot of people's minds. In most children's books, you have this picture with a little bit of text embedded in it. And in the instructions, it tells you here explicitly that you cover up the picture while the child is reading. So there's a picture here that shows what this story is about. But while the child is reading it, you have it covered up. So the child is always dealing purely with text. And when the child is done decoding the text, then the picture is uncovered and it's used as a comprehension discussion. And it's a reward for the child to see that he or she has actually decoded this thing correctly. Completely the opposite of most approaches to teaching reading. Irregular words are dealt with. There's a lot of irregular words in English, unfortunately, and they're simply handled as separate words. The child, according to his phonetic rules, would pronounce this as off, but has to learn that this particular word is of. Later in the book, the child transitions to a normal font. And here we're reading Ordinary Times Roman font. So when their skills are firm, the lessons introduce uppercase letters and they dispense with the font. This is from lesson 86, for example. All right, how does this compare to an approach that you might improvise as a parent? You might go out and buy a book like Hop on Pop from the delightful Dr. Seuss series and say, well, maybe this is a good way to start a child. And probably a lot of people do that, and probably a lot of children do succeed in doing things this way, but it's a hard road. You as an adult look at this book and you say, well, I think this is the first page, and you say, well, this is really simple. How could a child not get this? But the child really has no reason to get almost any of it. We have a mixture of upper and lowercase letters immediately. You know, why does the P look like this here and here and this here? The words will very likely be memorized. There's no rehearsal of sub-skills, so the child doesn't understand the concept that the word up could be decomposed into up, and that these letters represent those sounds. The child is presumed to know left to right, top to bottom. To the child, this is just a bunch of symbols on the page, and these are just another part of the picture, maybe. And in fact, the child may presume that reading is just reciting memorized stories from pictures. In this book, we have a confusing justification. So it's intentional here to show the correspondence between the last part of pup. Okay, it's designed to perhaps help the child phonetically, but it's also confusing. Why does up start to the right instead of being left justified like everything else? And then if you're going to do this, you have to devise a sequence of books to ramp up their skills. And that's a hard thing to do with very early readers because children are confused by different fonts and different styles of writing in different books. So if you're going to use this book, here are some important tips. You want to start at age 5 or 6. Do not frustrate a young child by forcing him or her to do a task that's not age appropriate. I am convinced that children simply do not have the mental hardware to perform decoding before certain ages, and it's different for different children, so you have to sense whether your child is going to be able to do this. Teach to mastery. Do not proceed to the next lesson until the current lesson is mastered. Repeat lessons as needed. Don't hesitate to repeat a lesson that is not mastered. So this is more like an athletic or a musical sub-skill. You wouldn't dream of moving on to more complex skills until you've mastered the simpler skills. But it's counterintuitive to parents and teachers for some reason who seem to feel that we need to move on regardless. Take a break if you need. A child who is strenuously objecting while struggling may be in over his or her head. So this has happened to me. I've trained children who, they're not developmentally ready for this yet. Decoding is not easy. It's probably the first really hard task that you will require of your child. Take a break for a few weeks or even a few months if you sense that the child is not ready. And if you have to do that, when you return, you want to review many previous lessons so the child is not starting with the lesson at which he or she quit. Don't wait. Once your child has been trained to read by guessing, predicting, deducing, and looking at pictures, these habits are hard to undo. Older children and adults who have ingrained these habits may not be able to undo them even after they've had phonics instruction. So I know adults like this who have been trained in phonics, they can't make themselves do it because they've been doing the deduction method and the word memorization method all their lives. And don't expect anyone to help you. Your first inclination is going to be like, why can't we get the schools to do this? Trust me, we've tried it. We've done it for decades. We can't. This book is available from many, many sources. I'm not going to recommend any one source. Prices are all over the board. Typically the price is $15. So you really shouldn't be paying more than that. You can get this book almost anywhere. You can do this. Think of it as a vaccination for your child against illiteracy. You don't need to be a teacher to do it. You don't even need to be a good reader yourself to do it. The instructional patterns are very simple. Just do it. That's it. If you would benefit, if your parent group would benefit from this talk, I'd be more than happy to talk either in person or with a Zoom meeting like this. Please contact me after this meeting and go to the contact us page of our site to send me a message.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. I know some of the material at the beginning was a bit sobering and probably not what parents were hoping to hear, but you provided us with some hope and some great strategies, a lot of great comments throughout the chat that highlighting phonics and phonemic awareness is really important in establishing good reading literacy. So I have a couple questions and wanted to start first with one from Denise. It says, does this conflict with in-classroom instruction? How and what to do to combat it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So whether it conflicts or not depends upon whether you make it into a conflict. You could think of this more as adding another skill. So think of it as a supplemental skill. Don't turn it into a conflict. I would not approach the classroom teacher with it and say, oh, we're doing this. We need to, turn this child into a decoder. Teachers are frequently, massively ideologically trained to oppose that, and they may want to stop you from doing this. Avoid the conflict by simply just doing it. Yeah, and not, your child can't suffer from this. I had classroom instruction in first grade that was not decoding. It was the look-say readers. It was up, this kind of books, and the kind of thing that I showed you an example of. What happened to me as a result of my mother teaching me phonics was that I was just able to breeze through all of those books. I thought they were ridiculous. And I remember being in first grade thinking that this was absurd and why were they giving me these silly books with these silly words in it. So you will turn your child into a powerhouse. There's no need to think of it as a conflict.
Great. So you talked a lot about how parents can use this book at home. Is there any experience in using this method with a classroom of 25 to 35 students? Or is it primarily maybe a supplemental piece for parents to use outside of the classroom?
Well, if you've got a classroom, you certainly could use this book in the classroom, I believe. I have not done that personally myself. During the 5 years when I was running a reading instruction program, we used Reading Mastery, which was designed for classroom instruction. The problem with trying to teach a group of 25 students is that you have to do ability grouping. And this is a subject that's too large for me to discuss in this short format here. So ability grouping is different children at different ages are ready for different things. And what we did in our instructional program was we tested them when they came in to see what their level of skills was. And we placed them using different components of our curriculum. So if you're going to do this with a class of children, you have to understand ability grouping before you do it. If you try to do it with a one size fits all, everybody, part of the problem we have is that everybody is assuming that everybody in first grade is ready to do the same things, and it's really not true. And if you have some children in a large group struggling while others are being fluent, you'll find yourself with a need to break this up into subgroups. So if you have the intuition to do that, go ahead and try it, but be aware of what you're doing.
Dave, talk a little bit about this approach and whether or not, from your experience, it's been successful with students with dyslexia. Assuming, Elizabeth asked, she assumes that maybe this approach is similar to an Orton-Gillingham philosophy of teaching reading decoding.
I am not an expert on dyslexia. I will say that there are a lot of children who, in my experience, are diagnosed with dyslexia who are actually not dyslexic. They simply need to learn how to decode, and they're simply not able to memorize hundreds of words or thousands of words. And so the easy thing for teachers to do with these failing students is to label them as dyslexics. If you have a clinical diagnosis of dyslexia, you will need to seek out some kind of special help. And Orton-Gillingham is frequently mentioned in the same breath with the reading mastery curriculum and with the kind of curricula that we use and teach your child to read. But I'm not really qualified to speak to that. But be aware of the dyslexia label. It's often inappropriately applied to children. In my experience, we had, in 5 years of dealing with children who had been basically rejected by the school district, we had only about 2% of the children who couldn't master the class on the first time through. And what we did was we put them back through the same class again. And at the end of the second class, they mastered the material. So we ended up with a 100% success rate. Whether any of those children was clinically diagnosed with dyslexia, I don't know.
So Dave, you talked about how starting this book at age 5 to 6 is appropriate. We had someone ask, is there a recommended age to start this? So 5 to 6. But we had a couple questions too about older children. Does this book work with older children, such as those in high school? What can be done for children that have recently graduated or they're in high school? How do we help them go back and gain these skills if they didn't get them early on?
This book is probably not going to work because it's going to seem too childish to that student. I mean, it's conceivable that you could use this book with such a child, but I've never tried such a thing. In our classroom, in our private instruction classrooms, we used a separate curriculum called corrective reading for children who were in the age range of 9, 10, 11, 12 years, who so we had a separate curriculum for that did not seem so childish to them, and it used a different approach designed by the same people. As late as high school, I honestly don't know. You'd have to go to someone else for advice on that. I'd say that at that late age, the odds of someone becoming a decoder are going to be small, and you're going to need some very specialized help if you're going to overcome that.
There's a question about Stillwater schools, and an attendee thinks that maybe they introduced this type of learning with limited success. Do you have any knowledge of the Stillwater schools using this approach?
My talk and my whole approach really is mostly based on national statistics. I don't know specific information about what they're using in which Minnesota school districts. I just know that the results that they're getting in Minnesota as a whole are kind of comparable to the results that they're getting in the nation as a whole. So you'd have to go in with someone, or you could, maybe I could find some resource that could figure this out for you. But it really depends, again, on what they're actually doing in the school. And without actually seeing what they're doing and looking in detail at it, it would be hard for me to comment on that.
Has this approach been successful in teaching English as a second language? So to teaching reading to ELL students?
Teaching a second language is really a different thing. And I have no experience with using this to do that. And I would not advise someone to use this to do that. It's not designed for that. It's designed to teach native speakers how to speak, how to read English text.
Anne asks, are you aware of the neuroscience studies that have found that children who cannot keep a steady beat almost always struggle with reading? Dr. Nina Cross, Auditory Neuroscience Lab in the Northwestern University, and her neuroscience scientists have explored this.
So now you're getting into the science of dyslexia, which again affects a very small part of the population, and I'm not really qualified to comment on that. I am not aware of that research and I've not heard about it. It certainly sounds like there might be something interesting to that. I would not discredit that, but I also don't know that there's truth to it. So it's an interesting subject that I'm not qualified to speak on.
Dave, can you talk a little bit about where attendees can find the resources for the corrective reading curriculum for older students that you mentioned?
I don't even know if corrective reading is still available. The reading mastery curriculum, which is the most successful reading curriculum in history, is almost not used anywhere. You can find it online. It is sold from SRA. The company that now owns the rights to sell this is SRA, which is Scientific Research Associates, I believe. So you would need to go on the SRA website, and on there you would look for direct instruction. There's a section in there about direct instruction, and you would have to see if they still sell corrective reading.
Great. We have a comment from someone who would like a little more information on the National Institute for Direct Instruction and your familiarity with their work and how they support users of direct instruction.
Probably the best approach for that, I'm not directly affiliated with them, I just use their curricula. So the best approach would be to go to their website, which was on one of my slides. I could go back and look at that. But if you just look up the National Institute for Direct Instruction, from whence I got that graph that I showed you, they will have the information on that site. I don't know even to this day. I've been out of the reading wars for a while and out of the classroom environment for a while. I don't know to this day what's going on with the NIFDI.
We have a question regarding, so you mentioned that changing the reading approach in public schools seems a little daunting and unlikely to happen. This attendee asks, how entrenched are the teachers' unions involved in pushing back against teaching the teachers to teach true phonics-based sequence multisensory direct instruction? There's an assumption that they're involved somehow because they do work with a lot of the education programs at colleges and universities that train teachers, but she's just wondering if you have any more insight into their involvement.
I can't really tell you, despite the fact that I work with people who are inside the system. Most of the people I worked with were really true believers in the system and ultimately believed that they would reform the system. Even years after we failed to get them to reform the system, they still have this sort of tunnel vision approach of that, well, we have to get the schools to do it. I don't know the internal mechanics of who is making these decisions, whether it's the school administration or whether it's the people who fund, whether it's legislatures who fund the schools at the national and state levels, whether it's the US Department of Education that's doing this, or how much it is. I'm not privy to the internal politics of the public schools, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for my sanity.
We have another question here. Has the emphasis on speed reading over the last few decades led to the new, quote, quote, new approach of word reading versus phonetic reading? Today's society seems to reward how quickly you read a book or a report or a passage, and less on learning to read the words and further to comprehend the words. Is this true?
I've never really touched much on the subject of speed reading. I would just simply advise against it. I don't understand, speed reading is something that you would undertake only as an extremely experienced decoder who's capable of normal speed reading. So to me, this is like some kind of icing on the cake. If you feel that you would benefit from speed reading, I've never felt the inclination to do it. That's fine, but I don't know the degree to which it influences classroom instruction. I've never known it to influence classroom instruction. If you want to understand the influences of classroom instruction, have me speak to your group and I'll give you the 90-minute version of this, or maybe the 6-hour version of this, and I'll talk to you about the ideas that have caused all of this stuff to happen in our classrooms. I'll give you a lot of detail about that.
Dave, we had an attendee ask about the reading comprehension portion of this book, and we actually had a parent who's currently using the book respond and say that the book does include comprehension and prompts the teacher parent to ask questions at the end. Can you talk a little bit more about that reading comprehension piece within the book itself?
Right. I view the comprehension piece to be sort of the final step in a reading exercise. So the child is reading it, and we want to, I mean, there is a connection that the child has to make here. The child is preoccupied with decoding while doing the decoding task. If you were just speaking to the child would not have to be preoccupied with decoding. So the possibility of comprehension problems comes from the fact that the child was so preoccupied with decoding that he or she was not actually interpreting the words that he or she was saying. All right, and that comes from reading material that's beyond the child's skill level. So you want to be careful that the child is comprehending, because you don't want to be getting the child into decoding stuff that he or she isn't thinking about. So it's just a check to make sure that we're not just purely decoding and occupying 100% of the mind with decoding. And in fact, it's kind of a check against speed reading. We don't want to speed read. We want the child to be thinking about what he or she is hearing when he or she is enunciating these words.
So you have a lot of experience seeing what reading strategies don't work being used in public schools. Any experience in seeing these phonics-based instruction used where schools teach phonics and not whole word used in private schools or other alternatives to public schools that might be encouraging as far as what reading strategies they're using?
Well, I'm not a big authority on what's actually going on in the schools, because I don't go into the schools myself. All of my knowledge comes from my associations with professionals who are embedded inside the school districts, and with consultants who have consulted to many school districts across the nation. So I get a lot of information from them. All I will say is that, for example, it is widely understood that there are private schools, especially parochial Catholic schools, that are teaching in deprived neighborhoods that with the same populations that the public schools serve. And these schools tend to have decoding-based reading instruction programs, and these schools, generally speaking, produce much better results with the same populations than schools that are obviously using different curricula. So it's all just empirical. You have to look at the data. There's really no way to gain access to these schools and see in detail exactly what's going on.
Right, and you mentioned too, that's part of how you realized that family members of your own couldn't read or didn't know how to read as well, despite good grades and that sort of thing. So, well, thank you, Dave, for your time on this. You're obviously an expert in this area. Oh, do we have one more question that popped in? Let's see. Where can we find objective data comparing the success of the various approaches in teaching reading?
I would start with, it has been a long time since I was delving into the objective data. There's researchers going back as far as 1975, a guy named Keith Stanovich. You could look up that name. You can go to the National Institute for Direct Instruction, and you can see the research comparing direct instruction to other programs. Once I got done fighting the reading wars, I really stopped looking at the reading research, because I didn't really need to rehash the same material over and over again. What you could do is you could look at some of the articles that we referenced. You could go to my website, mychildwillread.org, and read some of the articles that we reference on there. I really should add a research section to it. It's just that, in my own mind, I'm done with the research. I know it works. I have practical personal experience for years and professional experience for 5 years. And so I'm not focusing so much on that as I am on just getting parents to use what I know works and what the research has proven for decades works.
Excellent. We have a question here Dave, do you recommend parents of older children should access other parent resources from education because high-performing schools since 2014 across states have moved to using systematic phonics? The reading wars ended in 2000s, and since 2000, multiple national reading groups have published endorsements of systemic teaching of phonics as part of reading instruction. So she lists some examples here and asks, phonics or decoding alone is not enough, correct?
Well, it's a prerequisite. It's kind of like, okay, well, practicing scales and learning music theory and practicing chords and playing an instrument, no, that's not enough. You have to have exposure to actual musical literature, as it were, and in reading. Then once you're done with this book, for example, I have a 7-year-old grandson I just finished this book with, and he is now reading to me, and we're going out and finding real children's literature, and he reads to me. So no, decoding in and of itself is not enough, but it's a prerequisite.
Dave, are you aware of any research on the connections between visual and auditory regions through phonics instruction?
You're getting into brain science here, and that's really out of my realm. I'm really more focused on the practice, on the practical side of things, which is what can you actually do about this? You'd have to delve into some clinical research there and get into medical stuff that I'm not qualified to speak on.
We'll have to hold another reading webinar that focuses specifically on that. A lot of interest from today's attendees on that piece of it, but we appreciate the practical piece of it that you gave us and the hands-on how-to that parents can use right now. So we want to thank you for attending our webinar today and for all the great questions that were asked. Should you want to go back and re-watch Dave's presentation and look at his slides again, this video will be available on the center's Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and a link to this video will also be emailed to all registrants this afternoon. So with that, thank you again for attending and have a great rest of the day.